basically start looking at this whole concept around anti-discrimination. Now, to learn about anti-discrimination, we obviously have to start by learning about discrimination, and then we work backwards from there around what we can and cannot do in the workplace. Okay? So you see here, we've got our HC outcomes. This is section 3 directly taken from the syllabus. So this is, again, content that can be assessed in the HC examination for those students that are ATAR and are going to be sitting the HC exam. So we get started, bullying and harassment. You'll be familiar with this concept of bullying. You've heard a lot about it during school. But effectively, what you need to know is that bullying can happen in 2 different ways: direct bullying and indirect bullying. Direct bullying is where the bully says something to you or does something to you directly to your face. Okay? And so you're very aware in that sense that you have been bullied. Indirect bullying is where they've gone a roundabout way about doing it. So they might be about spreading vicious rumors. So they might not have said anything mean to you, but they've said mean things about you to other people. Okay? Or they've done things to you through other people. So there's that indirect concept. So direct is where they've done directly to you. Indirect is they've used other channels to still bully you, but without it being so obvious. Then within those 2 direct and indirect types, we can then split it again into what sort of bullying it is, whether it's verbal bullying, so calling people names or something like that, whether it's physical bullying, so actually pushing people around and that style of thing, whether it's psychological bullying, so playing with people's minds and intimidating them in that sort of sense, and also sexual harassment or sexual bullying, where people are basically using or abusing their bodies or your body in a way that is bullying or harassing. First things first, this is now, as of 2011, and I know that seems quite a while ago, but in terms of history in Australia, it's fairly recent. Bullying is now covered under the Health and Safety Act 2011. Prior to this, if you were bullied at work, this was something that was dealt with sort of independently at work, and there was a few different bits of legislation around anti-discrimination and equal opportunity, but effectively, bullying was almost a standard part of some workplace cultures, and it was really destructive, and it's obviously very hurtful and not correct. So what happened in this sense was, when they did a review of the Health and Safety Act, they said, no, this is a serious problem in businesses and we need to resolve it. So they've now placed it into the Health and Safety Act, where it is now illegal to bully and harass people. Okay, so that's what you've got to understand. There's that legal underpinning around bullying and harassment, which means all of the consequences that exist under the Health and Safety Act apply to people that are bullying. It also means that your employer has a duty of care to you to stop you or to prevent you from being bullied, to put you in a workplace where you feel safe, not just physically safe from hazards, but also safe from psychological issues, sexual harassment, physical bullying, verbal bullying, etc. That's all now covered under that duty of care that your boss has for you. There's also then the Anti-Discrimination Act from 1977. This is New South Wales specific legislation. Just like health and safety laws, there was a national framework put together, and then there was a New South Wales specific version of it put down. In New South Wales, under this law, you cannot discriminate against people or treat people unfairly or harass people, whether it's employees or people that are potential employees like job applicants, based on age, disability, sexuality, marital status, race, religion, any of those sorts of things. It's actually against the law to do these things. Not only is it against the law to treat your current employees and potential employees unfairly based on these things, but you also cannot treat their relatives different, their friends different, their colleagues different, or you can't even discriminate a colleague based on their friends or their relatives and their differences that they might have. Okay? The whole idea is that having people with different worldviews, with different opinions, with different lives, actually increases the amount of diversity in a workplace. And diversity is really good for workplaces. And we'll learn a little bit more about that later. We are going to summarize then this into this whole concept of rights and responsibilities. People that work at companies have the right not to be discriminated, not to be bullied, not to be harassed. Just as equally, they have a responsibility not to discriminate, not to bully, not to harass. And their bosses need to make sure that these things happen. This is called a reciprocal relationship, where you expect not to be discriminated against, but you also must not discriminate against others. And when we think about how we should be employing people, if I've got a list of candidates in front of me and I've interviewed 10 people for the job today, I don't pick the one that has the same religion as me, or I don't pick the one that's the same race as me, or I don't pick the one that whose gender is more preferential to me, or anything like that. The person that I pick for the job that I'm advertising for and interviewing for today, the person who is picked should be the best person to do that job. So we call this merit-based employment, and that's directly under the law. The people who get the jobs should be the best people for the jobs. There should be no other person that gets a job for any other reason, because then it's unfair. Okay? Once people have their jobs, they should continue to be treated on a merit-based system, which means your salary should be related to how well you do the job and your expertise. Your salary shouldn't be related to, what religion you follow, or what race you come from, or how tall you are, or any of those other sorts of discriminative concepts. Same goes for promotion, same goes for training opportunities, and all other sorts of benefits. No other personal characteristic, or no personal characteristics at all, other than how good you are at your job, should play any role in your job. Particularly things that come up very frequently in workplaces is age, pregnancy. You shouldn't be firing people just because they're pregnant, because you know they're going to be leaving anyway for some time off to look after their children. You shouldn't be just firing people anyway because they're nearly at their retirement age, and so what does it matter? Those sorts of things are not okay, and they come under discrimination. And this has been really, really interesting to think about, given the whole COVID-19 situation, where at the current point, we're midway through May at the moment, and the most recent statistic I've been reading is that we have something like 650,000 Australians that have recently lost their jobs. Now, the expectation is that if we reviewed every single case, no one should have been fired because they were pregnant, or because of their age, or because of their religion, or anything like that. The only time people should be laid off their jobs is when that job no longer exists, okay? Where the company is no longer able to pay anyone, and it should all be done on a fair basis. They shouldn't just be saying, oh, well, we've got to pick 5 people out of the 10 people that work here, so let's just pick the pregnant one and the old person. No, those sorts of things, they're illegal under this whole Anti-Discrimination Act 1977. We also need to think about this whole process of bias. It's really hard to ignore bias and to eliminate bias from the things that we do. But effectively, we need to remember that whatever we do, we need to be consistent in the approach we take. We need to make sure that when we are determining if someone needs a pay rise or whether someone needs to be fired, we need to make sure that we are being very objective, okay? Black and white, not being subjective where there's shades of grey. And we need to make sure we've set measurable standards that we can compare people to. And if you're not sure, you need to think to yourself, if I was that person, would I think that this situation I'm in is fair? And if it's not, then you need to really rethink whether there might be some potential bias in the process you're undertaking. Now, what I mean here is when you're interviewing, there's a big thing that a lot of people do where they trust their gut and say, no, this is the right person that we want. I just can't put my finger on it. I don't know what it is, but I think they should get the job. I know that girl has really good credentials on her resume, but I just have this feeling in my gut that the guy should get it. Those sorts of gut instincts are actually built into our body and our psychology, and it plays on the biases we have. Now, they might not be so obvious, but we need to remember we should compare apples to apples. So when we're interviewing, I know in my previous experience interviewing employers for jobs, we would have 5 questions. Each of those questions would be rated on a scale of 1 to 5 how well they answered that question. And then it was very easy to work out who should get the job because it was basically the person that had the highest score. And the things we would rate them on would be their communication skills and their ability to respond under pressure and their ability to problem solve. And they were the 3 skills we were looking for in our employees. So it was very clear, black and white, very objective, what we were going to do to determine who was the right person for the job. We also need to make sure that the next time we interview for people, we use an equally objective system. We can't just keep changing the goalposts every time. We also need to think that if you're not sure whether you're potentially discriminating or whether you've got some bias, one of the things you can do is you could actually ask for a third opinion. So you go to a different person who doesn't know either of the 2 people, you lay out the facts and say, person A has these skills, person B has these skills, who do you think we should hire? And so that's another good way to help determine whether you have eliminated bias. And it's for this reason that quite often we see group interviews and interview panels where we have a range of people all independently assessing so that we can compare to make sure we've got the right people being given the right jobs. Now, there's some of the strategies that we might have. Now, there are consequences to discrimination that happens in the workplace. Some of those things would be reduced productivity. If I'm being bullied at work, then I'm not going to feel good about myself, which means I won't be working as hard at my job. So that's the first thing. My productivity goes down. The second thing is, if it gets out in the media that people that work for this company are being bullied, then that's negative publicity and people might not want to work for our companies or might not want to sponsor our companies anymore. If I think of a fairly common example that's really well known in media, Alan Jones quite often gets picked up for bullying and intimidating people that he interviews. And as a result of some of the things that he says when he discriminates against people, is the sponsors that pay his radio show to be on the air have actually pulled out. So Channel 9, who owns his radio company, actually lost a whole heap of money as a result of some recent comments he made about the New Zealand Prime Minister. So there is negative publicity, and that then has financial implications back to businesses. You've also got to think that if I'm being bullied at work and I'm stressed and I just can't face going into work anymore, then I might need to take stress leave. And that's a financial cost for the business as well. The business needs to pay me to not be at work. And then because it's a health and safety issue under the Health and Safety Act, that then ties into workers' compensation claims and all the insurance premiums you have to pay, because that then comes out of your business's safety insurance. Then if I actually am not able to come back to work and I leave the company, you've got to replace me, which means you need to train someone new to do my job, and all the money you invested in me while I was training and doing the job is then gone. So there's another financial cost. Further to the financial cost for the company, you've got legal costs. Actually potentially going to court or in front of a tribunal when it's a really serious case that needs to be taken legal action. And then as a result of that, there can be compensation payable to the victim of the bullying if it was deemed that it was a systemic problem, people knew about it and nothing was done. So there are huge consequences for businesses and for individuals around this whole concept of being bullied. And so when you think about at school and you might say, teachers are taking this too seriously, you've got to remember, we've got that duty of care, we've got legal consequences, we've got financial consequences, the business also has all of these legal and financial consequences. It's bigger than just your one little incident that you think a teacher's taking too far. It's about nutting out and eliminating these bullying and harassing behaviours before people get into workplaces and it ruins people's lives. Now, if we think about what is the recourse, and when I talk about recourse, what can I get if I've been bullied? So obviously I get a whole heap of psychological trauma, but what can I get if I decide to take it to court? What's the benefit in me complaining? Well, if I make a complaint and it goes to court or it goes to the Fair Work Tribunal and they make a decision and they say, look, we agree you were bullied and it was unfair and it was this person's fault, I can be awarded up to $100,000 in New South Wales for that discrimination. Okay? Now, some companies, bigger companies, might also then make bigger settlements privately to stop the complainant from making public statements which would damage their business reputation. There are some other potential consequences as well, and this one here that I'm going to talk about is unlawful dismissal. Imagine you are a boss and you fire someone based on an unfair reason, an unjust reason. So you've said, oh, you know, this employee's just come up and they said, oh, they're pregnant, they want some maternity leave, and you say, nah, sorry, you're fired. If that's unlawful, the potential consequence for you individually as the boss, $12,600. We're not talking about like a $100 fine for speeding. We're talking really big money. Okay, so there are really serious consequences because as a boss, you have that responsibility to look after your employees, and unlawfully dismissing them, discriminating against them, is a breach of the law and your duty to look after your people. The second fine you see there is for the company. So as the boss, you might get fined $12,600, but then the company as well, who supported you in firing that person, it's a potentially $63,000 fine for them as well. Okay? Now, I'll be honest, these numbers here, they're the top level, okay? And they don't happen every time. It's only if it gets to a point where it goes to court and there is a judgment made. Okay? But there are plenty of other procedures that can happen. An example that I am familiar with is that there was an employee at a company that felt like they were being bullied and harassed at work. Their boss, okay, who was allegedly bullying and harassing, had no idea that they felt this way. Okay? And so this went to the Fair Work Tribunal, and rather than it being a legal issue, the Fair Work Tribunal said, no, this is a miscommunication. This is a misunderstanding between the boss and the employee and the boss. So to resolve this issue, rather than just saying, oh, you know, here's $100,000 and here's a $12,000 fine, they said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to have a meeting and we're going to get you to conciliate, where we chat to each other and explain our different sides so that we're aware of what the potential issues are and we can resolve them. As a result of that conciliation process with the Fair Work Tribunal, there was no longer any bullying or harassing claims at that business because the boss was aware of how his actions were being portrayed by his employees, but the employees were also aware of why the boss was acting the way they were. So because there was then that understanding, they realized that it wasn't bullying and it wasn't targeted and it wasn't picking on people. It was fair. It just might have been a little bit overly heavy-handed in the way the boss was sometimes dealing with things. So it doesn't always end up in fines and court cases. Okay? There are mediation processes that happen as well. And in addition to those formal mediation processes, quite often businesses are able to do this internally with their own HR departments where they resolve these issues in a really informal manner to try and prevent them from becoming bigger than Ben-Hur. So look, that's the end of anti-discrimination. And I hope that's been really helpful for you. There's a whole heap of information that's been packed into that last 20 minutes. Make sure you go back, you've written your notes, and then there's a couple questions coming up that we want you to have a look at. So thanks very much, and I'll see you next lecture.